Soviet engineers opened captured Panther tank, found dead German crew still inside. After 3 months, September 27, 1943, Poltava District, Ukraine. The cornfields had been cut down to stubble that scratched our boots and kept secrets in the furrows. The air smelled like wet earth and old smoke. I walked behind the scouts with my tool satchel thumping my hip, counting my steps without meaning to, the way a man counts when he wants time to move faster. They said there was a German tank in the trees, left since the July fighting, whole and waiting. If it was a Panther, command would want it at Kubinka. If it was a trap, command would want our bodies. We left the road for a stand of pines that sighed in the breeze like old men. My name is Sergeant Ivan Kozlov, engineer from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, and I will tell you what a machine smells like when it has been closed too long with men inside. But first, there was quiet, the brittle kind that lives in places the war has passed through and not yet claimed again. A paper scrap snagged on a branch, a line of ants finding something sweet in the husk of a pine cone. Somewhere beyond, a cowbell rang, thin as a coin edge. "Maybe a tiger," the lieutenant said. "Maybe nothing." He kept his voice low, as if the forest could overhear our optimism and punish it. We found it by accident, which is how you find most things worth fearing. The pines widened, and there it sat under a shawl of netting and cut branches, long gun forward, paint still the yellow-brown of a summer it hadn't outlived. A Panther, Ausführung D by the turret collar and those first series road wheels, tilted slightly where the earth had settled beneath the right track. No shell scars, no spall marks, no burned paint, blushed to the ugly blue of heat. It looked asleep. "Strange," I said. I walked the hull length, palm on the side armor, feeling welded seams with my fingertips. The metal held the night's chill the way a grave holds its silence. Fuel cap tight, exhaust shrouds intact, engine deck dusted but not charred. A good tank, a proud machine, a liar. The lieutenant rapped his knuckles against the turret side. "Panzer! Rouse!" The trees gave his order back in a softer voice. Nothing answered from inside the steel. The commander's hatch was dogged shut. I set my satchel down and worked the locking bar, a slow, stubborn turn that sent a thin ache through the bones of my wrist. The last powell let go with a small metallic click that sounded indecent, and I lifted the hatch. Rot always has a temperature. It rises like heat from an opened cellar, and it enters you through the throat. The first breath was a fist, the second was a lesson. Sweetness, like overripe fruit left in a cupboard. Ammonia, the flat, dry paper smell of uniforms. And beneath it all, the copper of something that should have stayed in the blood. I turned away and gagged into the pine needles while the lieutenant swore, and the youngest scout stumbled back, hand over his mouth, eyes wet and wide. When we looked again, our lamps throwing thin ovals of light through the hatch, the inside of the turret came into focus, not as a room, but as a paused moment. The gunner slumped against his sight, cheek to glass. The loader's knees were folded under him as if he had sat down on the floor to rest and chosen not to rise. The driver's hands had left a print of grease where they slipped from the levers. 5 men, each where a manual would put him, obedient to the last order the air allowed. No holes, no blood, no violence except the quiet kind that travels in breath. I let the lamp drift over the bulkhead seam, the engine partition, the flex coupling on the exhaust trunk, the hairline crazing where heat had worked the metal. There was a rubber hose cut long ago and then split by stress. There were gaskets that never met like lovers who speak different languages. The light found a family photograph creased into a command niche, a woman with a hand on a boy's shoulder, a baby squinting in sun. Someone behind me whispered a prayer. Someone else said my name twice and failed to make a question out of it. I put the lamp down and listened to the forest, to the flies, to the machine cooling around its failure, and understood that we were not looking at an ambush. We were looking at a lesson. We thought the enemy would kill us with shells. Today, the enemy taught me that some deaths begin as a yawn. Before I learned to smell death in metal, I learned to smell heat in metal. My father was a boilermaker on the Volga, a square-handed man who could read a seam by touch the way priests read scripture. In winter, when the river seized and the cranes stood like frozen herons, he brought me to the depot and let me watch the weld pool bloom and travel, a small red sun dragging day across the edge of steel. "Listen," he would say, cocking his head. "Good welds sing, bad ones cough." I thought every boy grew up measuring truth in sparks. We lived in Saratov, in a building that sweated lime in spring and sighed when the wind came hard down the river. My mother taught arithmetic to children who believed numbers were facts, a comfort I envied. She kept a jar for sugar and another for buttons, and the jars were rarely full at the same time. When I was 15, I apprenticed in a machine shop behind the rail yards. My first love was an indicator that did not lie. My second was a lathe that forgave my clumsy hands and taught them grace. I learned to chase runout until the needle stilled, to blue a surface and scrape it true, to whisper to bearings with oil the color of tea. A man can make a faith out of tolerances. I did not plan to be a soldier. I planned to be useful. In '39, the factory foreman wrote a letter that made me a technician and sent me to Kharkov to assemble gearboxes that would live under engines I never saw. Kharkov smelled like warm bread in the morning and hot cast iron by noon. On Sundays I walked past the new tractor plant and felt proud without quite knowing why. A country that can make its own gears is less afraid of the future. I met a girl in a library who wore her hair like a practical decision and laughed with her whole throat. Her name was Anya. We shared black bread on a bench and read poems that pretended the world would always be generous. June 22, 1941, put a match to those poems. The radio shattered the morning with words that bent the air: war, invasion, fascists. By evening, the shop had been given a choice that was not a choice. I lined up with the others because men who know tools do not stand aside when the house is on fire. They stamped me into the 2nd Guards Tank Corps as if I were another part coming off the line. Engineer armorer, the paper said, which meant I would carry both wrenches and a rifle and make promises to machines and to men. The retreat taught me humility faster than any master. We fixed what we could in ditches and barns, and sometimes in the open under the Luther sky, where Stukas stitched the ground into smaller pieces. I learned the taste of cordite and the way fear sits in the wrists. I learned that diesel warms slow in winter, and that a tank's breath fogs like a horse's when it is tired. In the first snow near Tula, I spent a night inside a T-34's engine bay with a lantern and a prayer, coaxing life back into a fuel pump with wire I stripped from a fence. The crew lifted me out by my belt and called me brother. In war, nothing binds like gratitude for a noise returning at the right time. By 43, we were no longer only running, we had teeth again. Kubinka sent us bulletins like weather reports. This German gearbox fails. This clutch overheats. This optic is excellent. Take it if you can. They wanted us not just to fight, but to learn. I liked that. It made the nights feel less wasted. I kept a notebook of failures and cures. I drew cross-sections from memory and corrected them in the field with chalk. When we captured a Panzer IV in spring, I wrote down every bolt size I found as if they were words to a language I might one day speak. I am telling you this so you will understand that when I lifted the Panther's hatch in the pine wood and the air struck me like a verdict, I already knew the grammar of machines well enough to hear what this one was trying to confess. Anya's last letter reached me in August, folded twice and soft from many pockets. She wrote that the library had been moved to a cellar and that the youngest readers were braver than most generals. She wrote that she kept sugar and buttons in the same jar now because there was no point separating hopes. She asked me to come back as a man who could still taste tea, not only smoke. I promised the paper I would try. I believed then that a good engineer could keep men alive by refusing to accept good enough. I believed that every failure could be traced to its cause and corrected if you had the time and the truth. War took the time. Machines hid the truth. But the beliefs remained, stubborn and perhaps naive, like a plant that finds a way through a crack in concrete because it has not yet learned the word impossible. The hatch opened wider and the light fell deeper. You can tell the difference between ordinary death and the kind that's been waiting. Ordinary death smells sharp, fast, blood, fuel, heat still leaking from metal. But waiting death has a sweetness that doesn't belong on the battlefield. It clings. It asks questions. We lowered a lamp into the turret. The beam cut through dust that moved like breath, as if something inside still exhaled. 5 men, each one in his place, just as the manual said, commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator, every lever where it should be, every switch in its ready position, nothing broken, nothing burned, just stillness. I reached inside and touched the driver's sleeve. The cloth gave way under my fingers, and a cloud of something gray and soft rose up and drifted toward the light. Behind me, Corporal Lebedev cursed under his breath. The lieutenant made the sign of the cross. I didn't. I was too busy studying the metal, following seams, tracing bolts, cataloging each wrong angle. There was no hole, no entry wound for death to come through. So it had been born inside. The gun breech was clean, the sight glass uncracked, the oxygen mask hooks on the wall hung empty. In the corner of the commander's station lay a dented tin cup, half full of something dark that had evaporated to a ring. Nearby, a photograph, stuck to the wall by a thumbtack, now rusted black. A woman, 2 children, a dog. The corner curled inward, as if trying to hide. It hit me then. The machine had become a room, and the room had become a tomb. I pulled my scarf over my face and climbed in. The air was thick and heavy. I'd spent enough hours in engine bays to recognize what was missing. Oxygen, the kind of absence that makes the body whisper sleep. The gauges still pointed to ordinary values. Fuel, 3/4. Oil pressure, holding. Temperature, high, but not fatal. Only the color of the residue around the seams told the truth. Gray-black, fine as ash, exhaust soot. The hose, there. It ran from the engine compartment, through a bulkhead gap no thicker than a hand, wrapped in fabric tape now split and frayed. I pressed my palm near the tear and smelled it. Burned oil, carbon monoxide, the invisible thief. They suffocated, I said quietly. The lieutenant leaned closer. From what? Their own engine. I pointed to the pipe. Cracked weld. Exhaust leaked straight into the fighting compartment. Gas like this doesn't choke you. It sings you to sleep. No one spoke. Outside, the pines were whispering, and the wind carried the sound of distant artillery, muffled by the forest. I looked at their faces again, what was left of them, and felt something twist. They weren't demons. They were boys, not older than the ones who rode with us in T-34s. Same hands, same half-grown beards, same disbelief caught between the eyebrows. The youngest had a tag around his neck. I wiped the grime away. Müller, Karl, Jahrgang 1924, 19 years old. The lieutenant said, "They died without knowing." "Yes," I said. "Their tank was a coffin that took its time closing." He nodded once. "We'll take it apart. Document everything." When I stepped back into daylight, the air outside felt too clean, almost thin. The forest smelled alive, sap, dirt, life stubborn enough to keep going. I stood there breathing hard, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and thought how strange it was that a man could die surrounded by steel meant to save him. We took turns hauling the bodies out. They came apart easily, too easily. We wrapped them in tarps and laid them side by side on the ground. The lieutenant wrote coordinates in his notebook. I wrote numbers, pipe diameter, weld length, hose material. My hand didn't shake. It should have. One of the scouts crossed himself again and whispered, "Poor bastards." "Yes," I said. "But their machine will tell us why." When the sun began to set, the shadows from the pines stretched long and thin across the hull, cutting the Panther into pieces of gold and black. For a moment it looked alive again, as if the crew might wake and start the engine, unaware they had already gone too far. War had taught me about weapons that killed fast. That day I learned about the ones that killed slow, and about how often we confuse progress with mercy. When we lit our cook fire that night, no one spoke. The flames hissed and spat against the damp wood, the sound almost like breathing. I remember thinking, if a machine can lie to the men inside it, maybe we all can. When I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph again. The woman, the two children, the dog, and the way the edge had curled like it was ashamed. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city, your country. Because before we continue, before we open the Panther and see what the Soviets learned from those 5 silent men, I want to know where this story finds you. We began dismantling the Panther at dawn. The forest was still wet from the night's rain, mist curling off the pines like breath. Everything smelled of resin and decay. The 5 bodies had been buried a few meters away under shallow earth that steamed in the morning cold. The lieutenant placed 5 small pine branches over the mound. No names, no ceremony, just acknowledgement. Then he turned to me. "All right, Sergeant, let's see what killed them." It was the kind of order that sounds simple until you have to make it honest. The tank was still beautiful in the morning light, sleek, purposeful, like a predator at rest. Its long 75mm gun pointed toward the fog, as if even now it was waiting for a target. I climbed up the glacis, the steel cold under my palms, and began unbolting the engine cover. The first few turns came easy. The rest fought like stubborn memories. Inside, the Maybach engine sat in a cage of soot. It was too large for the compartment that held it, the way a heart sometimes grows too big for a chest. The metal still carried a faint warmth, as if the death inside it hadn't cooled completely. I ran my hand along the exhaust manifold, cracked clean through. I didn't need instruments to see it. The fracture glowed dull red where the leak had burned it over months. Too much power for too little space, I said. You push it, it breaks. When it breaks, it poisons. The lieutenant crouched beside me. Can it happen in all of them? Yes, everyone built this way. He exhaled through his nose. Then they built their own curse. We documented everything, every measurement, every defect. We drew diagrams on field paper that smelled faintly of mildew and fear. By midday, the Panther lay open like an autopsy, its panels and plates scattered across the forest floor. From a distance, it might have looked like a broken bird, wings folded, body torn, head bowed. One of the mechanics, Yuri, climbed into the turret with a gas mask and lit a cigarette under the cracked hatch. "It's like a furnace in here," he shouted through the filter. "The air just sits, no way out." "That's what killed them," I said. "Not the enemy, the air." He didn't answer. He just looked around the compartment, smoke curling in front of his goggles, and muttered, "Some war, eh?" By afternoon, the lieutenant ordered us to test the leak. We reconnected the fuel line, started the engine, and sealed the hatches. The Maybach coughed, caught, and settled into a roar that shook the ground. A deep, confident sound, the kind of sound that makes men believe in machines. Within minutes, my carbon detector paper turned black. I tapped it against the turret wall. 1 minute, already toxic. 5 minutes, the lieutenant said. Lethal. We let it run for half an hour before cutting it off. When I opened the hatch, the first breath of air from inside hit like smoke from a pyre. Sweet, heavy, wrong. No soldier could have lasted. I remember leaning against the hull, wiping sweat from my forehead and realizing that I was trembling, not from fear, but from something colder. Pity, maybe, or understanding, because I knew that on the other side of the front, some German engineer was sitting in a factory just like ours, making the same calculations, asking the same questions, and being told the same lie. It's good enough. The lieutenant wrote his report that night by lamplight. I watched him pause after the first sentence, the pen hovering over the paper. "What's the official cause?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Design flaw." "That's the polite term." "Yes," he said softly. "The other one is negligence." Outside, the wind carried the smell of exhaust and pine sap. The war was moving west again, leaving behind things like this. Machines that had outlived their masters, secrets buried under steel. Yuri said we should tow the Panther to the railhead for transport to Kubinka. "They'll want to cut it apart properly," he said. The lieutenant nodded. "We'll send it tomorrow. Tonight, we rest." That night we built a fire beside the road. The flames painted the tank in orange light, and for a moment it looked alive again, eyes glowing through the periscope slots. I found myself staring at it longer than I meant to, wondering if the men inside had ever realized what was happening to them, if one of them had looked at the others and seen sleep spreading like fog. I thought about Anya's last letter, about her words, "Come back as a man who can still taste tea, not only smoke." And I wondered whether those 5 Germans had anyone waiting with words like that. Around midnight, I wrote in my notebook, "Panther, magnificent and monstrous. Beauty built too fast, death built too well." The fire burned low, the forest crackled with the sound of night insects reclaiming their territory. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint ticking of the engine cooling. It sounded like a heartbeat slowing after a long run. That was war now, a contest of hearts and engines, both prone to breaking. And as I drifted toward sleep, one thought followed me into the dark. If a nation can die of arrogance, maybe a machine can too. We stood around the Panther the next morning as the mist thinned into a bright, pitiless light. The forest was awake again, crows calling, branches cracking, the world pretending not to notice what we'd found. The lieutenant's order came down just after dawn. Prepare it for transport to Kubinka. Do not tamper further. Do not destroy. But he didn't look convinced when he read the telegram. He folded it, tucked it into his coat pocket, and stared at the tank for a long time. "You understand what this means, Sergeant?" he said quietly. "It means someone in Moscow wants to know why their miracle weapon suffocates its own men." He nodded, eyes narrowed. "And maybe they want to know how to make sure ours never do the same." The way he said it carried a weight I didn't like. I'd seen too many lessons in this war, how one army learns from another's mistake and calls it progress. We began making preparations to move the tank. The recovery crew had been sent for, but it would take a day or two to arrive. Until then, the Panther sat half open in the clearing, steam still rising faintly from its engine block. That afternoon, a patrol of infantry passed through, mud-splattered boys from the 53rd Rifle Division. They stopped to stare at it like peasants seeing a cathedral for the first time. One of them laughed nervously. "So that's the famous German beast?" I nodded. "Yes. Beautiful, isn't it?" He spat. "A pretty coffin." He wasn't wrong. When they moved on, I sat on the hull and ate bread gone hard at the edges. The steel was warm under me, as if it still remembered fire. My hands smelled of grease and pine sap, the two perfumes of this war. The lieutenant joined me. "I had a thought," he said. "Maybe we shouldn't send it." I looked at him, startled. "You want to destroy it?" He didn't answer right away. "You've seen what they'll do, Sergeant. Kubinka will study this thing. They'll fix the flaw, build it again, call it something new, maybe ours, maybe not. But the idea will live. And if we burn it," he looked toward the burial mounds, "then at least the idea dies here with them." I didn't answer. There was a silence between us that felt heavier than the tank. I thought about the countless engines I'd repaired, the machines I'd coaxed back to life, the pride I'd taken in their perfection. And now I was being asked to decide whether perfection itself was the enemy. He lit a cigarette and handed me one. "I'm not ordering you," he said. "I'm asking you. You found it. You decide." I stared at the smoke curling above the gun barrel. It drifted upward, thin and gray, like the exhaust that had killed those 5 Germans. I thought of the photograph I'd taken from the turret, the woman, the 2 children, the dog, and the note Anya had written about sugar and buttons. I thought about how easy it is to confuse making with meaning. "I fix things, sir," I said finally. "That's what I do. If I start breaking them, I won't know when to stop." He nodded once. "Then we send it." We did. But not before I walked around it one last time, touching the armor the way a man touches the coffin of someone he almost understood. I carved a small mark on the underside of the rear plate. Nothing official, just my initials and the date. A quiet signature to remind myself that I had seen the truth inside this machine. The recovery trucks arrived at dusk. The men winched the Panther onto the flatbed, chains clanking like handcuffs. As it rolled away through the trees, I felt a hollow ache settle behind my ribs. Yuri watched it go and muttered, "Strange thing, war. We bury men and rescue machines." "Maybe we're just burying the wrong ones," I said. The lieutenant looked at me, half smiling, half tired. "Don't let Moscow hear you say that." That night, Long after the engines had faded, I sat by the fire and opened my notebook. I wrote, "We have taken a ghost from the forest today. It will cross the continent to teach new ghosts how to breathe." Then I closed the book and lay awake, listening to the wind. It sounded like air moving through a cracked pipe, whispering the same lullaby that had put those men to sleep. The next morning, we moved out. The panther was gone. The clearing looked ordinary again, just trees and dirt, and the smell of rain. But I knew that something invisible had begun its journey west, something neither German nor Soviet, but older than both. The belief that any flaw can be turned into an advantage if you just have the courage to ignore the cost. And in that moment, I realized what the war was truly teaching us. It wasn't how to fight. It was how to forget what fighting costs. I saw the Panther again 4 months later. It was January 1944, and Kubinka was buried under snow so thick it turned tanks into shapes of silence. I'd been reassigned there after the front slowed, a reward, they said, for technical expertise. I knew the truth. They wanted the man who had found the ghost in the forest to watch it breathe again. The proving ground was a strange place, half laboratory, half graveyard. Captured German armor lined the test yard in neat rows, their black crosses painted over with red stars. Engineers in fur hats walked between them, taking notes that might one day decide how many men lived or died. The air smelled of diesel, frost, and ambition. When I stepped into hangar number 7, I felt the same cold I'd felt in the pines near Poltava. There it was, the Panther, reborn under the floodlights. Its armor had been scrubbed clean, its gun polished, its tracks reattached. A new layer of green paint covered the scars. To anyone else, it looked ready for war again. To me, it looked guilty. Chief Engineer Smirnov greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, you are Kozlov," he said, "the man who found our prize." "Not sure I'd call it that, sir." He laughed softly. "We call it that. You will too." They'd spent weeks tearing the tank apart, testing every bolt, every gasket, every breath of air that moved through it. They had charts pinned to the walls, temperature curves, fuel ratios, carbon readings. They spoke the language I loved, but there was something cruel about the way they spoke it. Smirnov handed me a clipboard. "We confirmed your diagnosis," he said. "Exhaust leak, carbon monoxide, ingenious engine, but poorly sealed. We've already corrected the flaw, installed new vents, rerouted the manifold. No more poison." "Good," I said. "Then bury it." He looked confused. "Bury it? No, comrade. We're just beginning. The engine's power is exceptional. The optics, magnificent. The suspension, superior to ours in every way. We'll learn from it. We'll build better." I wanted to tell him that better was just another word for colder, that perfection always asked for blood in advance. But I didn't. In Kubinka, silence was the only safe opinion. He led me to the test range. The Panther stood on the track, its engine idling with a low, confident hum. 2 mechanics sat inside, faces hidden behind masks. "We've made it breathe again," Smirnov said proudly. "See? No danger now?" I nodded, but I couldn't look away from the exhaust curling into the winter air. It looked exactly the same as before, thin, gray, innocent. When they drove it down the range, snow spraying from the treads, I felt something break loose in me. The machine moved like a predator that had forgotten it was dead. Every turn of the sprocket, every puff of smoke, felt like a repetition of the mistake we were all condemned to make, building something faster than we could understand it. Later, In the mess hall, a young technician sat across from me, eager and full of questions. "Comrade Sergeant," he said, "you saw the Germans work up close. You must admire it, yes?" I looked at his bright eyes, his clean hands, his faith. "Admire it," I said. "No, I respect it the way you respect a knife, useful, beautiful, and designed to forget who it cuts." That night, I walked back through the test yard alone. The moonlight lay on the tanks like frost, rows of steel shapes, Panzerviehs, Stooges, Tigers, all quiet now, all waiting to teach us what they had taught the men who built them. I stopped beside the Panther and placed my glove on the armor. The metal was cold enough to bite. For a moment, I thought I could hear it breathing again, the faint hiss of air moving through its vents, the whisper of ghosts still trapped inside. I whispered back, "You killed your own men, and now we'll make you ours." The wind carried my voice away across the yard, and I realized it didn't matter which flag flew above the hangar. Steel didn't care. Steel only obeyed whoever had the will to wake it. I left Kubinka a few weeks later. They sent me back to the front to fix the same T-34s I'd always fixed. When I looked at their engines now, I saw the Panther hiding in every weld, every seam, every promise of improvement. The war moved west. Towns burned, froze, and were reborn. The front devoured everything except its lessons, and I began to understand something that no textbook had taught me. We don't win wars by building better machines. We win them by surviving the ones we build. 30 years passed before I saw the Panther again. It was 1974, and I was an old man with bad lungs, 2 medals I never wore, and a habit of waking at night when I smelled gasoline. I had retired from the repair depot outside Kursk and spent my days teaching apprentices how not to crush their fingers under transmission housings. When a letter came from the military museum in Kubinka inviting me to attend the exhibition of captured technology, I almost threw it away. But curiosity is a disease that doesn't age. When I stepped into the hangar, the air hit me like memory, cold, metallic, exact. The Panther stood behind a rope barrier, spotless and still. Its armor gleamed under museum lights, a polished plaque read, "Panzerkampfwagen 5, Panther Ausf D, captured near Poltava, September 1943, restored at Kubinka Testing Ground, 1944. My name wasn't on it, of course, just coordinates, dates, data. No mention of the 5 dead men or the smell inside the turret. History doesn't record smells. A guide was speaking to a group of school children, his voice proud and detached. This was the most advanced German tank of its time. Powerful gun, thick armor, but mechanically unreliable. The Soviet T-34 remained superior. The children nodded, eyes wide, unaware of how easy history becomes when it's summarized. I waited until they left, then approached the guard and showed him my invitation. He let me step inside the rope. Up close, the paint still bore faint scars where our wrenches had slipped. I ran my fingers along the side plate, feeling the texture I once knew by heart. The steel was colder than I expected, like touching the memory of a winter that never ended. "Hello, old friend," I whispered. "Still keeping your secrets?" My reflection stared back from the black gloss of the gun barrel, an old man where once had stood a soldier with shaking hands and too much faith in machines. Smirnov had been right. The Panther's lessons had spread everywhere. The T-54, the T-62, even the monstrous T-72, all carried pieces of what we'd learned from this beast. The sloped armor, the interlocked road wheels, the pursuit of perfection at any cost. We had inherited the ghosts. A young curator approached, clipboard in hand. "Comrade Kozlov, you found this vehicle, yes?" I nodded. "We study it for design inspiration. Remarkable engineering even by today's standards." I smiled sadly. "Yes, remarkable. It killed its own crew." He blinked, unsure whether I was joking. "You mean in battle?" "No, inside." He frowned, politely confused, then excused himself. History prefers its ghosts neat and tidy. I stayed long after closing. The guard pretended not to see me. In the quiet, I imagined the Panther waking again, the slow pulse of pressure building in its pistons, the whisper of air leaking through those same vents. I could almost hear the men talking inside, their German voices muffled by the armor, asking when the heat would fade. It struck me that none of us, German or Soviet, had ever truly escaped the sound of engines. We carried it inside us, the rhythm of combustion and command, the noise of obedience. Before leaving, I took a small folded photo from my pocket, the same one I'd taken from the Panther that day in 1943. The woman, the 2 children, the dog. I'd kept it all these years, a relic I never explained to my wife. I placed it gently on the tank's tread, beneath the plaque, where no one would notice. "Go home," I whispered. "It's over." When I stepped outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and slow. The museum lights glowed behind me, illuminating rows of silent machines, German, Soviet, American, lined up like fossils of the same species. I realized then that we hadn't really defeated the Panther. We'd become it. Every nation that followed had built its own version, faster, stronger, more efficient at forgetting the men inside. That's the real legacy of war. Not victory, not ideology, just a better way to repeat the same mistake. I lit a cigarette, coughed once, and watched the smoke vanish into the white sky. It looked like exhaust, curling upward until it disappeared. Harmless now, but still the same color. Wars don't end, I thought. They just wait for another generation to mistake improvement for progress. This was one tank, 5 men, 1 forest. But stories like this are scattered across every battlefield, silent machines holding the last breath of those who trusted them. When I walked away from Kubinka that day, the snow under my boots sounded like a heartbeat, slow, reluctant, still alive. I realized something that took me 3 decades to understand. War doesn't need to lie to us. We lie to ourselves every time we call a weapon beautiful, every time we confuse invention with salvation. I used to believe that the Panther was a tragedy of German engineering. Now I know it was just human engineering, our endless hunger to build faster than we can feel. Somewhere, in another hangar, another nation is building something new, quieter, smarter, invisible. They'll say it's to protect us. They always do. And maybe, years from now, another old mechanic will walk through another museum and touch another machine and feel the same cold that I did. So if you're hearing this somewhere safe, maybe in a quiet room, maybe through your phone while the world hums outside, take a breath. Listen to the silence between the sounds. That silence is paid for. Wars don't end. They just change shape. The only question that matters is whether we remember the cost before the next one begins. Where in the world are you listening from? Tell me your city, your country, because stories like this don't belong to one flag. They belong to anyone who's ever looked at a machine and wondered whether it was protecting them or replacing them.